On a
Ow, look
cold
at the
winter
little babies
afternoon,
cry.
two German Shepherd puppies were left
Kick
on the
'em
side of the
again.
road to be beaten for fun. People drove past. Some slowed down. No one stopped. Then one woman did. She wasn't a hero. She was unemployed, on her way to a job interview, already afraid of losing everything.
Stop
But when
it.
she looked
You're
at those
hurting them.
puppies, she understood something simple and terrifying. If she walked away, they would not survive. She stopped the car, and in that single moment,
Don't
four
you dare
lives were
drive
pushed
away.
toward a future no one could predict. Winter settled over the city without snow, bringing only a dry, unforgiving cold. The sky hung low and gray, flattening the afternoon light and draining color from the quiet streets near the outskirts. Sarah Collins drove slowly, her car moving like it was unsure of its own direction. She was 32 years old, tall and slightly underweight, with the kind of lean frame shaped by anxiety rather than choice. Her brown hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, practical and careless, strands slipping free around her temples. Her skin was pale with faint freckles across her nose, the complexion of someone who spent most days indoors and most nights awake. Her face held a seriousness that rarely softened, not because she lacked warmth, but because life had trained her to be observant, cautious, prepared. Teaching had done that to her. Years in a public elementary school classroom had taught Sarah to read silence as carefully as noise. She noticed the small things hands clenched too tightly around pencils, eyes that avoided contact, the subtle signs of fear that other adults often missed. She had believed that attentiveness mattered, that if you cared enough, if you paid attention, you could make a difference. 2 weeks ago, that belief had cracked. The school district had let her go on a Tuesday morning. Budget cuts, they said. Nothing personal. She had nodded politely, thanked them, and packed her books into a cardboard box while the hallway buzzed with children she would never teach again. Since then, time had stretched strangely, days full of applications, polite rejection emails, and long silences that felt heavier than outright refusal. Today was supposed to be different. Her resume rested on the passenger seat, printed on slightly thicker paper than usual, corners creased from being checked and rechecked. The interview was scheduled for 4 o'clock at a private school across town. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance, a foothold, something to hold on to. The heater in her car clicked unevenly, releasing short bursts of warm air before falling silent again. Sarah kept her coat on, fingers curled loosely around the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead. She followed the navigation app as it guided her off the main road and onto a narrower stretch near abandoned warehouses and empty lots. She hesitated. She didn't like this route. It felt exposed, forgotten. But traffic behind her had been heavy, and she didn't want to risk being late. Being late felt like failure now, even when it wasn't. The road grew quieter. That was when she heard it. At first, it blended into the background noise, a sharp, broken sound that barely reached her conscious mind. Then it came again, clearer this time. High-pitched, strained, not mechanical, not human. Sarah's shoulders stiffened. Her foot eased off the accelerator, almost without her noticing. The sound came again, cutting through the sealed space of the car. A yelp, thin and desperate. Her chest tightened. She glanced toward the roadside and slowed further, her heartbeat beginning to climb. Ahead, past a leaning chain-link fence, stretched an open patch of dirt and dead grass. A rusted shopping cart lay overturned near the edge, wheels twisted at an unnatural angle. 3 men stood in the lot. They were dressed for no particular purpose, jackets half-zipped, jeans worn thin at the knees. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell they were drunk. Their movements were loose, uncoordinated, the way people move when balance no longer matters to them. One of them laughed, a harsh, careless sound that carried too easily in the cold air. Near their boots were two small shapes on the ground. Sarah's breath caught. They were German Shepherd puppies, no more than 3 or 4 months old. Their black and tan coats were dull, fur clumped together with dirt. One lay on its side, sides heaving rapidly as it struggled to breathe, ribs faintly visible beneath its skin. The other was trying to stand, back legs trembling, its body swaying as if it might collapse at any moment. A dirty rope lay coiled nearby. Sarah felt heat rush into her chest, sudden and sharp. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. One of the men, a stocky figure with a thick beard and a face flushed red from alcohol, nudged the standing puppy with the toe of his boot. Not violently, almost lazily. The puppy stumbled and fell, letting out a cry that made Sarah flinch. The men laughed. Sarah slowed to a near stop. Her mind raced, scrambling for explanations that would let her keep driving. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe there was context she didn't understand. Maybe someone else would intervene. But the puppies didn't move, except to tremble closer together. Sarah swallowed hard. She had never considered herself brave. She avoided confrontation whenever possible. In faculty meetings, she listened more than she spoke. When parents raised their voices, she kept hers calm. She believed that conflict only escalated when people met it head-on. But this wasn't a disagreement. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was cruelty. Her foot pressed the brake. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the road, engine idling softly. For a moment, she just sat there, heart pounding, breath shallow. She became acutely aware of how empty the street was, how far she was from help. Her phone lay in the cup holder, screen dark. She thought of the interview, of the careful answers she had rehearsed, of the suit hanging in her closet, chosen to make her look steady, capable. She thought of rent due at the end of the month, of the quiet panic that had been living in her chest since the day she lost her job. Her gaze drifted back to the puppies. They had pressed against each other now, small bodies seeking warmth and protection they couldn't find. One lifted its head slightly, eyes dark and unfocused, as if sensing something had changed. Sarah's fingers trembled. Behind the lot, one of the men turned. He was tall, with a sharp jaw and unshaven stubble darkening his cheeks. His hair was cropped short, uneven, and his jacket hung open despite the cold. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and when they landed on Sarah's car, they narrowed instantly. He stared at her. The laughter behind him faltered. Sarah froze. Time seemed to stretch, thinning into something fragile. She felt suddenly, painfully visible, alone in her car, stopped on a road she hadn't meant to take. The man's gaze held hers. She had not spoken, had not moved. But in that look, she felt something shift, something recognize her presence as an intrusion. Sarah still didn't know that if she stayed stopped, she would lose more than just a job interview. Sarah opened the car door. Cold air rushed in, sharp against her face, carrying the sour smell of alcohol and damp dirt. For a brief moment, she remained half-seated, one foot on the asphalt as if her body were waiting for permission from her mind. Then she straightened and stepped fully out of the car. Up close, the men looked rougher than they had from a distance. The bearded one was broad and heavy-set, his beard patchy and unkempt. Cheeks flushed deep red. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, the kind that slid past consequences without ever stopping on them. The thinner man swayed on his feet, shoulders slumped, his jacket hanging from him like it belonged to someone else. The tall man, the one who had turned to stare at her, stood more firmly, pale eyes alert despite the drink. His jaw clenched as if irritation were his natural state. "Stop," Sarah said. Her voice wavered, but it didn't break. She surprised herself with that. The bearded man barked out a laugh. "You lost, lady?" "They're animals," Sarah said, forcing herself to keep her eyes on the puppies instead of the men. "They're hurt. Just leave them alone." The tall man took a step closer. He was taller than she'd expected, his shoulders squared, his movements deliberate. A faint scar cut along his temple, the skin there paler than the rest of his face. Something about him suggested a past that had sharpened him rather than softened, someone who had learned, early on, that intimidation worked. "Get back in your car," he said quietly. Sarah felt her pulse spike. She was acutely aware of how small she looked next to them, how thin her coat suddenly felt. She thought of classrooms and children's voices, of how far away that life already seemed. "I'm calling the police," she said, her hand slipping into her coat pocket, fingers brushing her phone. The thinner man snorted. "For what? Dogs?" The bearded man nudged one of the puppies again, harder this time. The puppy cried out, a sound so raw and desperate that Sarah's chest tightened painfully. Something inside her snapped. She moved without planning it. Sarah lunged forward, shoving the bearded man's arm away with more force than she knew she had. He stumbled back a step, more surprised than hurt. The tall man swore and reached for her, but Sarah twisted sideways, her shoulder slamming into his chest. The world narrowed into noise and motion. Someone grabbed at her sleeve, fabric tearing slightly. She shoved back, heart hammering so hard she thought she might black out. She didn't feel strong, only frantic, but it was enough to create a second of chaos, a break in their rhythm. She dropped to her knees beside the puppies. Up close, they were worse than she'd realized. Both were filthy, their fur clotted with dust and dried mud. One had a raw patch along its shoulder where fur had been torn away. Their eyes were wide, pupils blown, bodies trembling violently. "It's okay," she whispered, though her voice shook. "I've got you." She scooped them up, one under each arm. They were lighter than they should have been, fragile bundles of bone and fear. One whimpered softly, pressing its face against her coat. "Hey!" the tall man shouted. Sarah staggered as someone grabbed at her back, fingers brushing her collar. She twisted hard, nearly losing her balance, and bolted toward the car. She fumbled with the door, puppies squirming weakly in her arms. A hand slapped against the side of the car as she shoved them into the back seat. One of the men yelled something incoherent. The bearded man laughed again, but it sounded uncertain now. Sarah slammed the door shut and scrambled into the driver's seat. Her hands shook so badly she dropped the keys once before managing to jam them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. She didn't look back as she pulled away, tires crunching over gravel and broken glass. Her chest burned as she sucked in air, breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Only when the lot disappeared in her rearview mirror did she realize she was crying. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Adrenaline surged through her veins, leaving behind a hollow, dizzy exhaustion. In the back seat, the puppies huddled together, their small bodies pressed tight, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 4:07 p.m. Her stomach dropped. The interview. She had missed it. She imagined the receptionist glancing at the schedule, crossing out her name. Another quiet door closing. The road ahead blurred slightly as her eyes filled again, but she kept driving. She didn't slow down until she reached the first intersection with traffic lights and passing cars, until the world felt populated again. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. The veterinary clinic smelled of disinfectant and warm air, a sharp contrast to the cold that still clung to Sarah's coat. She sat rigid in a plastic chair, knees pressed together, hands clasped so tightly they had gone numb. Under the fluorescent lights, her face looked paler than usual, freckles standing out against skin drained by adrenaline and fear. Her brown hair had slipped loose from its ponytail, falling in uneven strands around her face. She didn't bother fixing it. For the first time in days, appearances felt irrelevant. On the examination table, the 2 German Shepherd puppies lay wrapped in thin gray blankets. Up close, their youth was impossible to ignore. They were barely 4 months old, all oversized paws and fragile limbs. Their fur, meant to be dense and glossy, was patchy and dull, clotted with dirt that the technician had not yet washed away. One puppy had a shallow wound along its shoulder. The skin beneath was raw but clean. The other had bruising along its hind leg and flinched whenever it tried to move. Dr. Melissa Hart moved quietly between them. She was in her early 40s, with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes softened by long experience. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun streaked with gray, and faint lines framed her mouth marks left by years of delivering both hope and bad news. She spoke gently, but there was no false optimism in her voice. "They're lucky you brought them in when you did," she said, adjusting the IV line on the smaller puppy. "Another hour or two, and we might be having a very different conversation." Sarah swallowed. "They're going to live?" "Yes," Dr. Hart said. "But it won't be quick. They're malnourished, dehydrated, and traumatized. Recovery will take time. And care." Sarah nodded, even as a quiet panic bloomed in her chest. Care meant money, time, stability, things she no longer had. When the receptionist handed her the estimate, Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she took the clipboard. The numbers blurred together. She signed anyway. It felt automatic, like stepping forward because there was nowhere else to go. She left the clinic an hour later, with the puppies bundled carefully in a cardboard carrier, their breathing shallow but steady. The sky outside had darkened, the gray afternoon sliding toward evening. She checked the time, 4:46 p.m. The interview had ended nearly an hour ago. Still, she drove there. The private school stood behind a wrought iron gate, brick buildings neat and orderly, windows glowing softly from inside. Sarah parked and sat for a moment, gathering herself. She smoothed her coat, tucked her hair behind her ears, and picked up her resume as if that alone might restore what she had lost. Inside, the receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a polite, distant smile, looked up. "I'm here for the 4 o'clock interview," Sarah said quietly. "Sarah Collins." The woman checked the computer, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, the position's already been filled." Sarah felt something sink inside her, heavy and final. "I understand," she said, because she had learned how to say that. She walked back to her car without rushing, as if moving too fast might break her completely. Once inside, she sat with her forehead resting against the steering wheel, eyes closed, listening to the faint movements from the carrier in the back seat. That night, her apartment felt colder than usual. It was a small one-bedroom, sparsely furnished, the kind of place chosen for practicality rather than comfort. The walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph of her former classroom children smiling, arms thrown around each other. She hadn't had the heart to take it down yet. She spread an old blanket on the living room floor and gently laid the puppies down. They huddled together immediately, instinctively seeking warmth. One of them lifted its head weakly, dark eyes tracking her movement. Sarah crouched beside them. She studied them closely now, noticing the way their ribs rose too sharply beneath their skin, the way their paws trembled even in rest. They were alive, but only just. "I don't know how I'm going to do this," she whispered. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her bank account was nearly empty. She had no job, no safety net. She pressed her back against the couch and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees. The weight of it settled in, then not just fear, but a deep, aching sense of displacement. Teaching had been more than work. It had been identity, purpose. Without it, she felt unanchored, unsure of who she was supposed to be. The puppies shifted, one letting out a small, broken whine. Sarah reached out and rested her hand lightly on the blanket. The puppy leaned into the touch, trusting without understanding why. Her throat tightened. For the first time since losing her job, the reality became undeniable. She was unemployed, and she had just taken on 2 fragile lives that depended entirely on her. Outside, the city hummed faintly, indifferent and unchanged. Inside, Sarah sat on the floor of her empty apartment, watching the puppies breathe, wondering how courage could feel so much like fear. Daniel Brooks first noticed the sound at night. It wasn't a bark, not really, more a thin, uncertain whimper that slipped through the apartment walls when the building settled into silence. It came and went, never loud enough to complain about, but persistent enough to linger in his awareness. Daniel lived across the hall from Sarah Collins, on the same floor of the aging apartment complex. He had seen her only in passing before, a tall, slender woman with tired eyes and brown hair usually pulled back without much care. She carried herself with a quiet restraint, the kind that suggested someone used to being responsible for others. They had exchanged nods, nothing more. Daniel was 35, broad-shouldered, with a lean, solid build shaped by years of physical work. His dark hair was kept short, his beard trimmed close, framing a face with sharp angles and a perpetually thoughtful expression. A faint crease ran between his brows, a habit formed long ago and never unlearned. He worked maintenance for a local logistics company early mornings, late evenings, predictable routines. People sometimes mistook his silence for distance. In truth, Daniel simply didn't speak unless he meant it. The second night, the sound came again. Daniel stood in his kitchen, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, listening. He remembered another time years ago when he'd learned to recognize distress not by volume, but by tone. That lesson had come from a younger brother who'd learned too late how to ask for help. Daniel set the mug down. He crossed the hall and knocked on Sarah's door. When she opened it, she looked surprised and embarrassed. Up close, Daniel could see the strain in her face, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed perpetually drawn inward. Her skin was pale, freckles standing out against the soft yellow light of the hallway. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "If they're bothering you." "They're hurt," Daniel said gently. "Aren't they?" Sarah hesitated. Then she stepped aside. Inside, the apartment was sparse, almost bare. An old couch, a small table, stacks of books pushed neatly against one wall. On the floor, 2 German Shepherd puppies lay curled together on a blanket. They were still too thin, their ribs faintly visible, their fur dull and uneven. One lifted its head weakly, eyes tracking Daniel's movement before settling again. "They don't bark much," Sarah said quietly. "Just sometimes." Daniel crouched slowly, careful not to startle them. The puppies flinched at first, then relaxed slightly when he stopped a few feet away. "How long?" he asked. "Since yesterday," Sarah said. "I found them. She stopped, as if unsure how much to say. Daniel didn't push. "They need follow-ups," he said. "Food, probably rides, if you want help." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, as if measuring the weight of the offer. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "I don't have much," she admitted. Daniel nodded. "I've got a truck." That was how it began. Over the next few days, Daniel drove them to the clinic for checkups. He carried the puppies with a gentleness that surprised Sarah, his large hands careful and steady. At the vet, he waited quietly, leaning against the wall, listening without interrupting. He brought bags of dog food, not the cheapest kind, and old towels from his own apartment. He fixed Sarah's broken heater without being asked, kneeling on the cold floor until warm air finally flowed again. Sarah watched all of it with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She was still tall and slender, still exhausted, still unemployed. But now, when she came home, the apartment didn't feel as empty. The puppies were stronger, their breathing steadier, their eyes more alert. One had begun to follow her movements with quiet determination, while the other slept deeply, trusting the space around it. Daniel never asked why she'd stopped on that road. He never asked about the interview she'd missed or the men who had hurt the dogs. He didn't offer advice or reassurance. He just showed up. Some evenings, they sat on opposite ends of the couch, the puppies sprawled between them. The silence was easy, unforced. Sarah found herself speaking anyway, about teaching, about losing the job, about the fear of becoming irrelevant. Daniel listened. When he did speak, his voice was low and deliberate. "People don't stop mattering because the world stops paying attention," he said once. She remembered that. Trust grew quietly, without ceremony. No promises, no expectations, just shared routines and steady presence. Outside, the winter air remained dry and cold, the city unchanged. Inside the small apartment, something steadier took root, something neither of them rushed to name. Money disappeared quietly, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, relentless increments that Sarah noticed only when it was almost gone. The grocery receipt grew shorter. The heating stayed lower. She counted coins before doing laundry, and told herself it was temporary. She was still tall and slender, still moving with the careful posture of someone trained to stand in front of classrooms. But the hollows beneath her eyes deepened, and her brown hair, once pulled back with purpose, now fell loose more often, neglected. Her skin looked thinner, paler, stretched by worry. Each morning she checked her email with a restrained hope that faded by noon. The puppies were getting stronger. They were still young, barely past 4 months, but their bodies had begun to fill out. Their coats, once dull and clotted, now showed hints of healthy black and satin beneath careful brushing. One was bolder, following Sarah from room to room with clumsy devotion. The other remained cautious, lingering near doorways, watching the world as if expecting it to turn cruel again. Sarah named neither. Naming felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Daniel continued to help, though he never made it feel like charity. He brought groceries and left them on the counter without comment. He took the puppies for short walks when Sarah had interviews that went nowhere. His presence remained steady, broad shoulders, quiet eyes, beard trimmed neatly as always. He spoke little, but when he did, it mattered. One evening, as they returned from the clinic, Sarah noticed a car idling across the street. It was older, paint dull, windows tinted darker than necessary. She paused on the sidewalk, puppies tugging lightly at their leashes. The car pulled away. She told herself it was nothing. 2 nights later, it was parked there again. This time, the engine was off. The streetlight cast a weak yellow glow over the hood, and for a moment Sarah thought she recognized the shape of the driver inside. Her heart skipped, then steadied when the car rolled forward and disappeared down the block. She didn't sleep well after that. The 3rd time, there was no mistaking it. Sarah was returning from a late trip to the convenience store when she heard footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate. She stiffened, grip tightening on the bag in her hand. The puppies sensed it too, bodies tensing, ears lifting. "Hey," she turned. The man stood a few feet away, tall and lean, face partially shadowed beneath the streetlight. His jaw was sharp, unshaven stubble, dark against pale skin. The scar along his temple was unmistakable. Her breath caught. "You," he said, eyes flicking to the dogs. "Didn't think we'd see you again." Fear surged hot and immediate. Sarah's pulse thundered, but she didn't step back. She couldn't. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He smiled without humor. "Sure you do." Another figure emerged from the shadows, shorter, broader, the bearded man from the lot. His laughter was softer now, less careless, edged with something colder. "Cops came around," the bearded man said. "Asked questions." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "I didn't call anyone," she said. It was true. The tall man tilted his head. "Doesn't matter. You made noise. You made trouble." The puppies growled low in their throats, small bodies pressed close to her legs. Sarah felt their fear like a current through her own body. "What do you want?" she asked. "Quiet," the tall man said. "People like you learn to mind their business." A door opened down the street. Light spilled out. The men stepped back instinctively, retreating into the shadows. "We'll be around," the bearded man muttered. They vanished before Sarah could respond. She stood there long after they were gone, hands shaking, breath shallow. The puppies whimpered softly, confused and frightened. That night, she told Daniel. They sat at the small kitchen table, the overhead light harsh against the exhaustion etched into Sarah's face. Her fingers trembled as she wrapped them around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Daniel listened without interruption. His jaw tightened as she spoke, the crease between his brows deepening. "They threatened you," he said quietly. "They didn't say it outright," Sarah replied. "But it was clear enough." Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. The muscles in his forearms tensed beneath his sleeves. "You shouldn't handle this alone." "I don't want to make things worse," she said. "I don't have anything left to lose, but they might." Daniel studied her for a long moment. He saw what she didn't say: the fear of retaliation, the dread of drawing attention when survival already felt fragile. Silence settled between them. The choice hovered there, heavy and unresolved. Sarah lay awake that night, listening to the puppies breathe, the city murmuring beyond the walls. She thought about silence, how easy it was, how tempting, how it promised safety in exchange for looking away. She had made that choice once already, and now the darkness had followed her home. Morning came with wind. It rushed between buildings and along the sidewalks, bending bare branches and carrying the sharp bite of winter without snow. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, tall and slender in an old sweater, brown hair loosely tied back, watching the street below as if it might answer a question she hadn't yet learned how to ask. She had slept very little. The night before, after hours of silence and indecision, she had finally made the call. Now she sat at the small table, hands wrapped around a mug she had already forgotten to drink from, waiting. The knock came just after 9. 2 police officers stood in the hallway. One was a woman in her late 30s, dark hair pulled into a tight bun, posture straight and professional. Her name was Officer Karen Miles. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind, the kind shaped by years of learning when to push and when to listen. Beside her stood a younger male officer, quiet, observant, taking notes more than speaking. Sarah answered their questions slowly, carefully. She described the men, the lot, the threats. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. She didn't dramatize. She didn't minimize. She told the truth as clearly as she could. Daniel stood nearby, arms crossed, jaw tight. His presence grounded her. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak for her. He simply stayed. Officer Miles nodded when Sarah finished. "You weren't the only one," she said. "There were other reports, and there's footage from a nearby warehouse camera." Relief hit Sarah so suddenly she had to sit down. By afternoon, the truth unfolded quickly. The men were identified. Prior complaints surfaced: bar fights, animal cruelty citations ignored, a pattern of intimidation that had gone unchecked because no one had followed through. Until now. Accountability arrived not with drama, but with inevitability. Sarah watched from the window as the police cars pulled away, the street returning to its ordinary rhythm. The danger that had hovered so close finally loosened its grip. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders dropped. That afternoon, her phone rang again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. "Sarah Collins?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes. This is Linda Warren, principal at Oak Ridge Learning Center. I was given your name by Dr. Hart." Sarah's heart skipped. Dr. Melissa Hart, the veterinarian, had mentioned that her sister served on a school board. Sarah hadn't thought much of it at the time. She hadn't expected anything to come of a casual conversation about resilience and responsibility. "I reviewed your background," Ms. Warren continued, "and I spoke with your references. We have an opening. It's not full-time yet, but if you're interested—" "Yes," Sarah said. the word escaping before fear could intervene. "I am." After the call ended, Sarah sat very still. She wasn't crying. She wasn't laughing. She was simply breathing, as if her body needed time to understand that the ground beneath her was solid again. Daniel found her like that, sitting on the edge of the couch. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up at him, eyes bright, face still pale, but softer now. "I got a job." He smiled, not wide, not dramatic, but real. It reached his eyes, easing the tension that lived there. "That's good," he said, and then, after a pause, "You earned it." In the days that followed, life didn't transform overnight. Money was still tight. The job was modest. Healing human and otherwise took time. But the puppies grew stronger. Their coats thickened and shone. Their legs steadied. They learned to trust the sound of footsteps and the closing of doors. One discovered joy in chasing leaves across the grass, ears flapping wildly as it ran. The other stayed closer to Sarah, always checking back, as if needing reassurance that safety was real. One afternoon, Daniel joined them at the small park nearby. The wind swept across the open field, cold and bright. No snow, just movement and sound and life. The puppies ran. Sarah laughed, a soft, surprise sound that seemed to catch her off guard. She stood there, tall and slim against the winter light, brown hair lifted by the breeze, freckles warming her face. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was merely surviving. Daniel watched her quietly. He thought of how easily she could have driven past that lot, how silence would have protected her in the short term, how courage had cost her everything, and then, slowly, given something back. They stood side by side, not touching, not rushing. Somewhere between shared fear and shared hope, something had changed. The puppies returned, panting, tails wagging, pressing against their legs. Sarah bent down, resting her hands on their backs, steady and warm. There was no snow, but the cold no longer felt so heavy. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they arrive as a choice. The choice to stop, the choice to care, the choice not to look away. In a world that moves fast and asks us to stay silent, compassion is never an accident. If God places something broken in our path, it may be because He trusts us to act. We don't always see the outcome right away. We don't always know the cost. But every act of kindness, no matter how small, is seen. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder. Faith lives in what we do when no one is watching. Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, or share a moment when kindness changed your life. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach hearts around the world. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. And may He place compassion in your path and courage in your hands every single day.